This week's 1044 is brought to you by Chevron Delo 600 ADF Ultra Low Ash Diesel Engine Oil. It's time to kick some ash.
Diesel prices are more than $1.30 higher now than the same time a year ago. What's behind that trend and how long will it last?
Hey everybody, and welcome to the 1044, a weekly webisode from the editors here at CCJ. I'm Jason Cannon and my co-host on the other side is Matt Cole. Diesel fuel prices have been on an upward track since the beginning of November 2020. As of the week ending November the 8th, the average price across the country for a gallon of on-highway diesel was about $3.73, according to the Department of Energy. If you're out in California, you're probably seeing it about $1 higher than that.
There are a number of factors that have gone into the recent price increases that we've seen, but the primary driver has been simply the price of crude oil, which has increased from around $40 a barrel in May 2020 to now upwards of $80 a barrel. I spoke with Tom Cloza, Global Head of Energy Analysis for Oil Price Information Service, who talked about some other factors, including some directly related to trucking, that are affecting fuel prices.
I think most of it has had to do with crude. I mean, there'll be a lot of things blamed. There'll be politics blamed or whatever, but it's the price of crude, and the price of crude is like $80 to $84 a barrel. Now, it's interesting because the last time you had crude oil prices in that neighborhood was probably 2014. And the price of diesel wasn't necessarily that high, and the price of gasoline was considerably lower. But there's a lot of extra expenses that have gone into the chain. There's probably about 750,000 barrels a day, or about 5% less refining capacity than there was 7 years ago. And driver shortages, I don't need to tell you about driver shortages, but tanker driver shortages have really, really manifested themselves in markets. There's a lot of places where, if you would take a delivery, let's say from Port Everglades to the Florida Keys, where, that cost of that delivery is twice what it was. And then if you go to the truck stop or the station level, now, people have different opinions on this. I happen to think it's a good thing, but there's a lot of people that are getting paid more, and whether it's state or whether it's just supply and demand, but those wages have really crept up. So there's a lot of things there, and people can get a little bit more margin.
Tom said depending on how cold of a winter we have this year, diesel prices may not improve much for the next several months. But before we hear more from Tom, let's hear from 1044 sponsors, Chevron Lubricants. Protecting your diesel engine and its after-treatment system has traditionally been a double-edged sword. The same engine oil that is so essential to protecting your engine's internal parts is also responsible for 90% of the ash that is clogging up your DPF and upping your fuel and maintenance costs. Outdated industry thinking still sees a trade-off between engine and emission system protection, and Chevron was tired of it. So they spent a decade of R&D developing a no-compromise formulation. Chevron Lubricants developed a new ultra-low ash diesel engine oil that is specifically designed to combat DPF ash clogging. Delo 600 ADF with OmniMax technology cuts sulfate ash by a whopping 60%, which reduces the rate of DPF clogging and extends DPF service life by 2.5 times. And just think what you can do with all the MPGs you're going to add from cutting your number of regens. But Delo 600 ADF isn't just about aftertreatment. It provides complete protection, extending drain intervals by preventing oil breakdown. Before, you had to choose between protecting your engine or your aftertreatment system, and now you don't. 600 ADF from Delo with OmniMax technology, it's time to kick some ash.
I think diesel is going to be the product to watch in the next 5 or 6 months. I say that because it's really the only fuel that can be substituted when natural gas problems arise. Now, you'll hear lots of different estimates of how much can be substituted in Asia or in Europe. I've seen it happen in the United States when we get natural gas curtailments. I mean, we have a lot of natural gas in the ground, but we don't have a lot when you get, downstate places like Chicago or New England or whatever. And then the price can really rise exponentially, or you can be turned off of natural gas for a power plant. And when that happens, they start buying diesel. I'll give you an example. Spent most of my life in New Jersey, and there's a bunch of casinos there. Well, the casinos are interruptible customers that when there's a shortage of natural gas or there's not enough to handle hospitals, schools, and homes, the casinos get interrupted. When they're interrupted, that stuff flies out of terminals and you'll have people pushing 80 or 100 trucks a day into Atlantic City. So if you get a vortex kind of winter, you can really have, just incredible rises in prices in diesel. And the other thing that's happening is we're exporting a lot of diesel to Latin America, where the refineries are not operating properly. And if you get fuel switching in Europe or Asia, it could mean that we'll be exporting to some of those places as well. So it wouldn't surprise me if gasoline prices stayed where they are, but I think diesel is going to be the bigger performer in the next 5 months.
Some truck stops in Arizona and Ohio recently reported diesel outages and were limiting customers to just 60 gallons per fuel up. Tom doesn't expect that to be a widespread issue going forward unless the winter months are colder than expected.
I would say the one thing that's happening is that the problems we saw in distributing gasoline during the peak times there for in the spring break, and during the summer vacation season, they're starting to surface on the diesel side as well. I mean, I heard of a number of locations, I believe in Arizona and Ohio, where, there were some runouts and they didn't last long, but I think that last 10 miles or so of getting the diesel to the truck stops or to the stations is problematic. And again, it'll be much more problematic if we run into colder than normal temperatures. And by the winter, we can talk about meteorological winter, but to me, it's Thanksgiving through President's Day. That's it. That's when you really got to keep your fingers crossed. I wouldn't call them shortages. I'd call them outages. And I don't want to nuance that too much, but it's just, they're measured in hours. I think shortages is where you really don't have them at the terminals. And for the most part, we've got enough refining that's restarting in the rest of November that we should be okay. But, that counts a lot on temperatures. We've got 2 refineries in Louisiana that aren't coming back. One is the Phillips refinery in Alliance, Louisiana, made a lot of diesel. And the other one is the Shell refinery in Convent, Louisiana.
Tom said the outages in Arizona were easier to explain due to its geographic location than the outages in Ohio, but he believes those were limited events. California's high diesel prices could have also had something to do with low diesel supply in Arizona.
Arizona is a tough place to supply. You can supply it slowly from Texas, and you can supply it from the Southern California pipelines. So it's always going to be an area. And plus, if you look at the census data from 2010 versus 2020, a lot of people have moved to Arizona, and there's a lot more going on there. Ohio's a little bit different, but Ohio tends to be really dependent on a couple of refineries, and they're probably in turnaround right now. So I think they'll be okay. That's an odd one because it's not as though everybody's, sitting around the dinner table and going, let's move to Ohio. They want to move to Sunbelt places, and they do have their own refineries there, but it can get stretched very thin. We have a just-in-time inventory system, and it's become much more just-in-time because in the old days, you could play 2 or 3 transport truck carriers against one another and, shave that last penny or so off of freight. Right now, the carriers are the hammer, and the customers maybe are the nail, or the distributors are. And particularly in places like Arizona, Nevada, the Mountain West, that's where I've heard, of a lot of companies, transport truck carriers, doubling the rates for hauling fuel. You're definitely going to optimize your system by trying to avoid fueling up at truck stops in California. There's no question about that. I guess, optimally, you could fuel up in West Texas or whatever, going on I-10. But yeah, California is a place to avoid filling up. whether it's jet fuel, whether it's gasoline, or whether it's diesel these days. And it's only going to get worse. And I say worse, the air quality is getting better. All right. So let's not hide from that. It has really, really improved in California in the last 30 years. But, they're paying for carbon. And you may see some other states charge for carbon. I think Washington has got some things underway, and you hear about it in New Mexico and Pennsylvania and maybe New York. So, one of the things, not so much this coming year, which is going to be an election year, by the way, but at some point down the road, we're going to see a lot of states that are going to be charging something for carbon. You may not call it a carbon tax, but there'll be fees that get embedded in the system, and it's all based on carbon reduction.
There's been a push, especially on the West Coast, for renewable diesel, but Tom cautions that the energy transition away from carbon fuels in general is going to be much slower than many believe.
The West Coast is always problematic, and what you have to realize is they've rationalized some refiners there that they might think will become stranded assets. And you'll hear about that they're going to make renewable diesel. But the amount of renewable diesel they make on the footprint of the refinery compared to what they used to make for traditional carb diesel and gasoline is pretty small. And that's a trend for this decade we have to worry about. People are seduced into believing that the energy transition away from, high carbon fuels, that it's going to happen in months or maybe a few years. I think what we learned in Europe and to a certain extent Asia is that it's going to take half decades or even scores. And if you get seduced by how easy it is, the stranded assets that you might think get stranded in 2025 could get stranded much sooner. And then we'll all pay a lot higher prices to pay. So that's one of the things that we've got to watch out for. And it's easy because the rhetoric is just so centrifugal. On the left, it's like, let's stop using carbon. We need to go all electric. Where on the right, it's all Biden's fault. We're not bringing in, we didn't have the Keystone pipeline, when we're actually importing more Canadian crude than ever by far. And somewhere in the middle is where we are. If either side gets a little bit too seduced, it's the consumer and the commercial carriers that get hurt.
Looking at the near term, Tom believes trucking companies should brace for even higher diesel fuel prices than what we're already seeing today. But he doesn't expect that to last very long, barring any unforeseen circumstances.
I think that what we're going to see is now California marches to the tune of its own drum. And you could see it, in that $4.50, $5 range, just like we saw with gasoline. But the rest of the West also is going to have inspired our higher prices. We saw that this summer with gasoline in the Rockies. I think on a national basis, if I were setting the over under Vegas and it was $4, I would take the over for at least a brief period of time. But I don't think we'll average those numbers for a long period. It's kind of like crude. There's a lot of predictions of crude oil getting to $100 or $125 a barrel. And they may get there for a moment, on some sort of a blowout day or whatever, or a short covering rally, or, something that has the same mechanics behind it. It's like these meme stocks and GameStop and Bitcoin. But I think the market's too big to stay up there for a long time. And it's too damaging to economic growth as well. So that's my over-under number. I say we'll go over it for a brief period of time if it's colder than normal. If it's warmer than normal, and particularly if it's the northern hemisphere warmer than normal, not just North America, but let's say Northwest Europe as well, we got a lot of optimism baked in for cold temperatures and a lot of degree days, and it may disappoint.
That's it for this week's 1044. You can read more on ccjdigital.com, and as always, you can find the 1044 each week on CCJ's YouTube channel. And if you've got questions, comments, criticisms, or feedback, please hit us up at 1044trucking@gmail.com or give us a call at 404-491-1380. And until next week, everybody stay safe.